Thank you very much. So we're probably at that point in the day where everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. So hopefully we'll try and move on to some topics that we haven't covered and mix it up a little bit. I'm very excited to moderate this discussion. Two of the best in the business here. Matt Olsen is the current director of the NCTC. He's had the full gamut of national security jobs. He's been general counsel for the NSA, an advisor to Attorney General Eric Holder, acting assistant attorney general for national security, and special counsel to the FBI director. His predecessor at the NCTC is Mike Leiter. Mike was the second director of the National Counterterrorism Center from 2007 to 2011. And he is now senior counselor to the CEO of the data analytics company Palantir Technologies. Is that it, Palantir Technologies? And he's also a national security analyst for NBC News. So why don't we begin with a very broad question, and that is, what is the current state of the threat from terrorism? Where does it emanate from, and how serious is it? And Matt, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, thanks a lot, Ryan, and it's great to be here. It's always daunting, actually, to talk about. You said we've talked about a lot of these subjects today, and to follow John McLaughlin talking about the threat is particularly daunting. But I'll give it a shot and then turn it over to you, Mike. I mean, I would say right off the top that the threat is very different now from a counterterrorism perspective from what it was 10 years ago, certainly, and really even 4 years ago. Thinking of it at a couple of different levels. First, as has been noted, the threat from core Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan is really significantly degraded. We really don't face the same threat of the type of attack like we experienced on 9/11 in any measure. The group is really struggling to survive, to recruit, train, and operate. But it still remains sort of at the vanguard of a movement, and it still is looked to for leadership and guidance from the affiliated groups. And just to mention probably the one that concerns us all the most, that's AQAP, because that group in Yemen has retained both the capability and the intent to carry out an attack against us here at home, having tried 3 times to take down airliners over the last few years. Beyond that, beyond the affiliated groups, and again, John in the prior panel talked about this, the whole expanse of unrest and turmoil in North Africa and parts of the Middle East have led to the rise of sort of loose networks and temporary groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Benghazi that was part of the group that carried out, or part of the individuals that carried out the attack against our facility in Benghazi last year. Those types of groups definitely pose a threat to us in the region. They are less of a threat to us here at home. And then the final group to mention in this very quick answer is the threat from homegrown extremists. And there, obviously, the attack in Boston is the most clear example. And really, the challenge for us is individuals like the Tsarnaevs and others who've carried out such attacks don't tend to really hit our radar. They don't travel to Pakistan or Yemen. They don't communicate in the same way. They can learn what they need to know on the internet and become radicalized on the internet. And so from that perspective, pose a real challenge to us from a counterterrorism perspective. So as we brief the threat, I think overall, I would say it remains persistent. It is, but it's increasingly complex and diverse, and that's why it's so challenging.
Well, first of all, always good to be here in Aspen. Clark, thank you for another great event. I also want to honestly commend Matt for the fantastic job he's done making the NCTC into something functional after I left. But also, I think people should understand who aren't in government, it actually is a really big deal for a current and a former to sit next to each other. And it says a lot about Matt's confidence and ability at NCTC that he's willing to stand up, sit next to the guy who can say anything the hell he wants. And NCTC,
it's always good to keep him close.
Yes.
That's my main theory.
Exactly. I agree with Matt's assessment of the threat entirely. I'd add a couple of very small items. First, we've been talking about the threat. We talk about all the places that are horrible in the world. We really have to remember how unbelievably successful the counterterrorism efforts of the U.S. have been over the past 12 years. I do this a lot, but if I had asked a group like this on September 12, 2001, how many Americans do you think, or how many people will be killed in the United States by Al-Qaeda over the next 10 years? My guess is I'd get some answers of 1,000, I'd get some answers of 10,000. I'm almost certain no one would say 18, which is the total number of American people in the United States who have been killed by Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorists in the US in the past 12 years. So we've done remarkably well. The threat that Matt described, I think, is accurate, but I think we also have to look at this in a strategic sense and understand that we're never going to defeat any of these threats entirely. What we can do is reduce the likelihood of a catastrophic attack, and we are always going to be susceptible to some of the, as tragic as they are, the smaller scale attacks that we see in a situation like Boston. The only final piece I would add is we're always focused mostly on Al-Qaeda and Sunni extremism. I think certainly over the past 2 to 3 years, people started to become slightly more aware of the threat of Shia-inspired extremism, namely from the Iranian Quds Force and Hezbollah. And certainly, if we approach a greater conflict with Iran, or the West approaches a greater conflict with Iran over the next year, we will undoubtedly face a renewed and invigorated Shia-inspired terrorist threat. We've seen some of that already, the plotting against the Saudi ambassador in Washington, and other attacks overseas. So this is something that for the counterterrorism community, especially during an era of declining resources, we have to make sure we keep our eye on.
If I could just say, in addition to what Mike said, I think in part because it really encapsulates the complexity of the challenge, and that is to focus on Syria for a second. So in Syria, obviously we have the opposition to the Assad regime. Within that opposition, we have a growing extremist group, al-Nusra, that is seeking to become an official affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and it is probably the most capable fighting force within the opposition. And then on the other side, as Mike mentioned, we have a Shia extremist group, the Hezbollah, joining forces with Assad. And then within that milieu, we have the existence of chemical weapons. And then on top of that, and I think from NCTC's perspective, probably the biggest concern is the flow of foreign fighters to Syria. Syria has become really the predominant jihadist battlefield in the world. So we see foreign fighters going from Western Europe and in some cases, a small number of cases from the United States, to Syria to fight as part of the opposition. So the concern going forward from a threat perspective is these individuals traveling to Syria, becoming radicalized, further radicalized, becoming trained, and then returning as part of a global jihadist movement to Western Europe and potentially to the United States. So really it elucidates so many of the ways in which the threat is complicated and again persistent.
I want to ask you both about President Obama's May speech on terrorism. In that speech, he noted we were at a crossroads. He said we need to ask ourselves hard questions about the nature of today's threats and how we should confront them. What specifically did that speech change, or what did it mean for the NCTC? How did it change your mission, if at all?
Well, I think it was an important speech, and I'm lucky to be there. I took some NCTC analysts, and we were there to watch it.
Would you tell us if it was not an important speech?
Yeah, sure. No, not at all. But to say we were at a crossroads. So I think the president, in some ways, and this isn't really just NCTC specific. This is the counterterrorism community, the intelligence community. I think in some ways all of us in this room really challenged us to do two things: to think hard about the threat. And to be really precise and rigorous in how we define the threat and not fall into the trap, in some ways, what I think we fell into, or we saw after Benghazi, of really a binary choice. This is Al-Qaeda or it's not Al-Qaeda. And that's not the reality of the threat we face. It's much more complicated than that, and we need to be careful in how we define who is Al-Qaeda and what the threat is. Because, of course, how we define the threat then is the crux of then developing a strategy, and that was the second part of, I think, how the president challenged us, how to think about the strategy as we look to keep up the pressure, but also look to a time when we are not in a state of perpetual war. And I think that also was a way in which, again, he challenged, I think, everybody in this room who's part of this conversation.
Mike, how important was that speech as a policy statement, and what is the counterterrorism world post that speech?
I mean, I think it's a critical speech, and I generally align myself with almost everything the president said. And I think it was really valuable. 12 years later, it was probably the most comprehensive statement, certainly by this president, and arguably even going back to the time immediately after 9/11 about how the U.S. government and our allies should approach terrorism. I can do this now because I'm no longer in the administration, and I don't mean this as a political critique. I really mean this as a apolitical counterterrorism, national security professional critique. Mm-hmm. I think there were some things which weren't in the speech, in part because it's the president and he's not going to get into detail, but I think the questions for NCTC and the national security community that are still key, to name a few, would be, I think there really was a dearth of discussion of homegrown extremism. I think this is probably the threat which is most relevant to a lot of Americans' lives, and it may not be the greatest threat in many ways, but it's the most frequent threat, and I think we still have a long way to go. We've really sharpened our spear on the overseas piece more effectively than we have the domestic piece. The second is I was disappointed not to have any mention of weapons of mass destruction. And we've done a really good job of reducing the likelihood of terrorists having access to chemical, biological, radiological, or improvised nuclear devices. But, I mean, talk about a game changer. Terrorist use of any of these tools would be really significant, and we have to keep our eye on that. And the last piece, which Matt now has to deal with, but I think is incredibly important, is now that you've changed the way in which we look at this threat and how we address it, what does that actually mean for programs and budgets and government organization? And I thought Ash Carter did a brilliant job this morning of talking about those concrete choices you have to make when you face strategic choices. Well, we have now had the strategic playing field, I think, aptly described by the president. The question is, when you now look at 10%, 20%, 30% budget cuts, how are you going to actually allocate those finite resources in a sensible way across the counterterrorism community? And NCTC's policy role, I think, has an enormous role in that process, and it is not one that the U.S. government has proved particularly effective at doing yet.
And I don't necessarily disagree with anything Mike said about sort of these other issues. I think at the end of the day, I mean, this was it was an hour-long speech as it was, and it covered a lot of ground.
Should have been an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah, it could have. But I do think it was a speech for serious people thinking about these questions. And but on the one question, the WMD issue, I would reiterate what Mike said. That for us at NCTC, of course, the likelihood of a WMD issue right now is low, but the consequences are extraordinarily high. So by that, for that reason, we keep our eye on WMD threats quite closely.
Matt, I want to ask you about counterterrorism partnerships. The last few years, we've been told regularly that two developments would damage our partnerships abroad. One, the leaking of classified data. The WikiLeaks was supposed to be extremely damaging. Now the revelations from Edward Snowden. And then two, the Arab awakening, which has led to the weakening or overthrow of regimes that have been very cooperative with us. What, from where you sit at NCTC, what is the fallout from both of those developments in terms of intelligence sharing and cooperation?
So let me take the second part first in the Arab Spring or Arab awakening. Al-Qaeda didn't have anything to do with that, but they are trying to take advantage of what's happening in these countries. And I think it's important also to say it's not one dynamic in every country. In other words, if you look at Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Mali, each one is quite different in how the change and turmoil in the region is affecting those countries. The primary way I think for us that it's affecting our counterterrorism efforts it's basically placing a greater degree of importance on developing our relationships with these emerging regimes. So in Libya, which really we really are seeing a decrease in its capabilities to carry out any sort of counterterrorism efforts. We need to try to figure out how we're going to work with the emerging government there, and the capabilities are really wanting in large part. In Yemen, we have a good relationship and an improving relationship with President Hadi, and so each country, we need to stay engaged and work with the legitimately selected government in those countries. But that is hard, and it's Benghazi really shows why it's hard, because these are dangerous places, and having our diplomats and our military and our intelligence officials in these locations carries with it inherent risk.
But is it on the leaks? Is there any demonstrated reduction of intelligence sharing because people say, oh, the United States just can't be trusted with secrets anymore? Everything leaks out.
I think it remains to be seen on Snowden. I'm worried about that. I'm worried about it when I see what I read coming out of, and particularly with respect to Europe and our European allies, how they may be reacting to this. But I think it just actually remains to be seen on that.
So I'm going to be stronger than Matt on that, because Matt, again, has to be a diplomat, and I don't have to anymore. First of all, I will be shocked if there are not indications within intelligence that Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups do not change the way they operate based on these leaks. We've seen it in every other leak situation. It happens. It makes Matt's job harder. Second, I was still director immediately after WikiLeaks. And I can tell you that every place I went overseas, for the hour-long meeting, we easily had half an hour of that with me having my head bitten off and getting yelled at by our foreign service colleagues saying, how could you be so sloppy? Why can't you control information? We will not share information with you. Like
are those just idle threats, or?
No, they're real. It's not that the Brits are going to stop cooperating with us. And it's not that if the French get the tip about a bomber is coming to the U.S. tomorrow, they're not going to tell us. But they are going to be much, much closer hold on information that they collect in the run-up to understand the environment. It absolutely undermines those relationships. And last but not least, the quietly understood relationship of partnership at times between the U.S. government and very, very patriotic American companies has been really important in national security matters since going back to World War II. And if I'm a multinational CEO or CEO of a multinational, and I've been cooperating with the U.S. government because the courts tell me to do it this way, and this is what I was supposed to do, and now suddenly my market is getting killed because everyone is holding up the fact that you don't want to work with X, you should work with our company, because if you work with X, the NSA gets everything. That makes future cooperation with the U.S. government on national security issues, in accordance with the law, much more difficult. So in my view, all three of those have serious impacts on our national security.
And I would foot stomp actually Mike's first point on our adversaries and what they're doing, and that because we have seen in response to the Snowden leaks, the Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups seeking to change their tactics, looking to see what they can learn from what's in the press, and then seek to change how they communicate to avoid detection and avoid our surveillance.
I think there's a lot of mystery about what NCTC does and its role in the larger counterterrorism world. I want to talk about about some of the central roles that it has. One of the changes that happened on your watch, Mike, was the culling of names for targeted killing moved from the National Security Council and the Pentagon to really being centralized at NCTC. There's obviously been a lot of controversy about that. Can you, either of you, to the extent you can talk about it, what is NCTC's role in developing and culling the targeted killing, the list of names for targeted killings? And is that accurate the way I explained that history?
Not entirely, but I'll narrow it a bit.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, this is a criticism that we heard from Congress and elsewhere. I see Eric Schmidt out there. Eric and others wrote about this, that you had, in theory, that the CIA had a quote-unquote kill list, and the Department of Defense had another list, and the lists didn't match up, and all this confusion. That's not entirely true either. But you also had the possibility that you have the people who are responsible for operations making intelligence calls about how bad someone is or is not. And that can lead to I'm not saying there were, but it can lead to some perverse incentives about how you draw these analytic judgments about who is, no kidding, an imminent threat to U.S. national security because they are plotting in X country. So what NCTC's role became, and I think it was an appropriate one for NCTC, because NCTC is made up of analysts from CIA and FBI and DHS and DOD, and it's not attached to any one operational arm like the CIA or Department of Defense, that we could work with the entire community and say, yes, it turns out that we see Mr. Smith is in fact plotting, he is an imminent threat, and as long as there are legal authorities which you believe he falls into that category, this is where we would prioritize him to be, detained, targeted, and the like. And I think that was a very important role for NCTC. The other piece I would say is NCTC, in the policy role, worked hard to help develop options. And there's a lot of people now say, well, the U.S. government isn't capturing people, it's just killing them instead. At least in my experience, the idea that anyone didn't want to capture anyone you could was flatly crazy. Like, if you could capture someone, you captured them. But in a lot of circumstances, you couldn't. And NCTC worked with the interagency, the FBI, again, DHS, DOD, and others, to develop the options of what you could do with someone if they were captured, if they were arrested, things like that. So I thought that was a valuable role to make sure that there was an interagency flavor to that decision-making that ultimately led to decisions at the National Security Council and the White House.
Let me answer the question this way. We're approaching 10 years in existence next year to 2014. And really building on the work, when I came into this position, building on the work that Mike did, and before him Scott Redd, and before him John Brennan, NCTC has worked to become a center of gravity on CT, both on the analytics side and on the planning side. And just taking analysis for a second as an example, so the White House now looks to NCTC to take a look at what is the threat going to look like after 2014. Very strategic. But it also looks to NCTC to describe who is this guy, who is this operative, and what's his role, what is the intelligence on him, and really one of the benefits that we bring, I think, to doing that is that everything we do in that regard is a coordinated effort. So we bring together the information. John McLaughlin talked about the critical role of fusing information. So that's really the bold idea that animated, the creation of NCTC. But it's not only just information; it's also people. So analysts and officers from around the community work together and produce a product, whether it's about the threat looking strategically or an individual looking tactically, that represents the view of the entire intelligence community. So that when that's presented to policymakers, senior policymakers, it reflects that that entire coordinated view, and I think that's really valuable.
Another issue that's come up in the last year with NCTC is the data that you don't have access to and want. And last year you changed the guidelines, the federal guidelines, from the 2008 guidelines, and the new guidelines allow you now to basically get, tell me if I'm wrong, access to any government database. When this debate happened in the administration, the DHS objected to one database that NCTC wanted. You've got the rule changed. One, just take me through that debate. What was the thinking behind changing those rules, which a lot of privacy advocates are not comfortable with? And what government database does NCTC now have and collect that it couldn't collect under the 2008 rules? How are you using these databases? And why shouldn't I be completely terrified by this?
You shouldn't be terrified by it, Ryan, at all. So, and this effort really started under Mike, and we continued it. So I'm gonna put my arm around Mike here. But so a couple things right off the top, and this could get very wonky very quick. So I'll try to not do that. But we don't collect any information ourselves. We get information from other government agencies that themselves collect, whether that's NSA, CIA, FBI, DHS. And so we're not collecting it. This has been lawfully collected by other agencies. The key insight, and I know Mike can speak to this more firsthand than I, came after Abdul Muttalib on Christmas Day 2009, that we did not have access to some of the types of information that would help us stop the next underwear bomber. We had great access to threat information coming from the reports that are provided to us by CIA, signals intelligence report from NSA. What we didn't have was the type of access we needed to terrorism databases. So information about individuals who are applying for refugee status or in the United States, or individuals applying for visas or to travel to the United States. Because what we needed to do was have that information, and not just have it for a minute or a day or a week, but to have it for a long enough period of time so that when we got threat information from the CIA, from a source overseas that says this guy is a bad guy, all we have is a name or a first name, what can we do to compare that information to the other information that we've also lawfully collected, that the government has about people who are traveling here or seeking asylum here, and marry that up so that we can then take that information and then provide it to those agencies, FBI in particular, that can act on it. And it was my perspective that this was something actually that the American people felt we were probably already doing, and would have been somewhat surprised to learn that we were having trouble doing. So we worked very hard over the last few years to work with the civil liberties and privacy community, as well as our DHS and FBI and the other agencies involved to increase our access.
What was the objection from DHS on that initial request for that database that so worried the chief privacy officer there?
Well,
she said this would be a sea change in the way that the government interacts with the general public.
Well, I just think it was, there's a concern, and I understand the concern about aggregating data. And so we work closely with the DHS and with privacy groups to design rules that would protect the data, so that all the usual things you would want and expect: audit, training, oversight, to make sure that we were doing this as carefully as possible. And we worked with the Department of Justice ultimately to have new guidelines that are approved by the Attorney General, so they are appropriately protective of U.S. persons.
I see you want to weigh in here.
This is there's a beautifully, carefully leaked statement by one individual at DHS about how they felt about this being a sea change. Frankly, there were many other parts of DHS that absolutely wanted this to be done. And Matt's absolutely right. Of course there are civil liberties issues here. Matt and I are both lawyers. We actually do get these issues. But you have to understand the whipsaw that people in Matt's position, when I have my position, can find themselves in. Matt's had this, but a few months before Christmas Day, I was up arguing for the extension of the Patriot Act, certain aspects of the Patriot Act. And I had congressman after congressman, senator after senator say, why do you need to spy on Americans? What is going on? And I had people yelling at me saying, why is my constituent watch listed? Why are they on the no-fly list? Fast forward 3 months later, Christmas Day, and it is, why aren't there more people on the watch list? Why aren't there more people on the no-fly list? Fast forward to Boston. Why aren't you spying on more Americans? Why can't you collect more data? So these issues about U.S. persons, they are real issues. But we've got to, in my view, stop flying the pendulum back and forth, trying to grab it at the right time and get somewhere in the middle. And the perfect example on this for DHS is someone, Bill Smith comes to the United States on January 1st. And all you have is Bill Smith and his phone number. Under the old guidelines, 91 days later, that information had to be flushed from NCTC systems. And if on day 91, on 90 days that'd be flushed. On day 91, if you got a tip from the CIA that this phone number was associated with Al-Qaeda, and that was Bill Smith's phone number, NCTC wouldn't know it. Right? Imagine that hearing when the attack occurs. So the issue here was, how long should NCTC be able to keep this done fully in conjunction with the people who collected the information in the first place? As Matt said, the auditing, the review, trust and verify. And frankly, the old system wasn't calibrated post 9/11, and it wasn't calibrated post 2005. They were fundamentally guidelines from 2000, and the world had changed and expectations had changed.
And just on the transparency point, we adopted these new guidelines and we put them on our website. And then on the whipsaw, I still have a crick in my neck, because last week we had this great forum with civil liberties and privacy representatives from ACLU, EPIC, EFF, a number of different groups on a Wednesday, very, very concerned about our aggregation of data, as well as some of our watch listing practices, as well as NSA leaks. That was one day, then less than 24 hours later, I was in a congressional hearing where the focus was on Boston and our failure to do more on Tamerlan Tsarnaev, given the information that we'd received from the Russians. And so it was a complete 180. And maybe that's about right, we're going to have that, but it's actually very, I am concerned when that happens for the intelligence community and intelligence professionals who need predictability, and need to be able to know where the line is in order to do our jobs. And that kind of swinging of the pendulum is very problematic.
It seems like this is an issue you're going to be dealing with a lot more going forward, because it seems like the first decade of the NCTC, you built up a lot of capabilities with overseas intelligence agencies, have strong partnerships, but increasingly are looking for both data sets that the U.S. government has, but also state, local intelligence from state and local officials. And just seems like that penetration into the domestic sphere gets people a little bit more concerned. Talk to me, one, about that, but then two, about going forward, the relationships you would like to build with state, local officials and the intelligence that they have.
So I think that's a really good part of this conversation, and this has come up a couple times today. Charlie Allen and others have mentioned some of the challenges we face in the domestic sphere, and for understandable and appropriate reasons. But I do think for the last several years, and particularly under Mike, we made real gains in sort of how we interact at NCTC and how the community as a whole interacts looking overseas, making sure that information is shared properly, making sure that we have a sort of all of government effort when we're looking at threats emanating from overseas. It's much more difficult and much more challenging when you start to look at the picture inside the United States. So we have just a much more complicated structure of FBI and DHS at the federal level, and then the thousands and thousands of state and local police departments, and then you throw in fire departments. Because really the challenge for us, and really the Tsarnaev brothers are examples. How do we make sure that our local police departments and our firefighters, who may be the first responders, who may see something that's suspicious, how do we make sure that that information gets put into the national intelligence picture so that we can marry up what's being seen at that very, very local level, and how that...
Not terrorism.
Yeah. How do we make sure that that's getting married up with national threats? And so I think for us and NCTC, that's going to be a challenge going forward, working with the FBI and DHS to design that domestic architecture in a way that really starts to replicate what we've been able to achieve looking overseas.
Mike, well, just to be specific on this, what is the kind of intelligence that you wish you had when you were the director that going forward you'd like to have from state, local officials?
Perfect.
Perfect as in everything?
No, I actually don't want everything, both because it's a bad privacy, civil liberties, and then you have to go through everything. You just want the important stuff.
Yeah.
And what anyone who's worked in this field knows is you don't know what's important until after you've gotten it and after you've compared it to a lot of other stuff and after circumstances begin to evolve. So how do you get what's a reasonable amount, protected in certain ways, and then compared in ways and try to figure out, I mean, the whole connect the dots thing is so 2001. Now, it's utterly simplistic because you don't know what dots you're looking at. You don't know what dot is meaningful until you're comparing it to other dots. So what would I want? I do think that we've come a very long way. The FBI has evolved tremendously. Joint Terrorism Task Forces, which are these interagency, state and local, they investigate things very well. But what we did simultaneously was we invested lots and lots and lots of money in useful state and local fusion centers that get information from state and local police, goes up, and they try to correlate it. And the problem is that these two pieces are semi-independent, not completely independent, but semi-independent. And what we saw in Boston, I think, is that we've got to merge these two together more effectively. And once you have that, you can actually have the FBI working with DHS in a way of saying, I can't cover Tamerlan Tsarnaev. We've closed the case, but if you guys want to look at it with your resources, go for it. And then for NCTC, what NCTC can bring to that equation, I think, is taking that information about things that maybe look significant or don't look significant. And comparing that, again, in an audible, civil liberties protected way, comparing that with lots and lots of data that FBI and DHS don't have. I mean, you would have liked to know, this didn't happen, but if Tsarnaev had called somebody in Yemen, and once the FBI closes that lead on him, NCTC can play a really valuable role in continuing to look at data to see if that's the case, hand that back to the operators in the US and have them look at it. I can't say all that without saying one last thing though. It's a harder problem, I think you're right, because it requires greater domestic work. We haven't really, since 2001, had a great national conversation in terms of domestic surveillance. It's not particularly well understood by many in Congress. But even if we do all these things, we can't expect to stop all of these. These are very, very hard plots to stop. And we're going to stop them in a variety of ways. We're going to stop them by not letting people get the right fertilizer so the bomb doesn't go off, Basel Shazad in Times Square. We're going to stop them because John Pistol's guys are going to keep them from using a good explosive device when they got on an airplane, like Christmas Day. And sometimes we're going to stop the bleeding by having a really, really effective response to an incident like Boston. Right. But some things are going to get through, and what we can't do is then, put Matt up against the wall and throw darts at him. We have to make sure that Matt's done his best. We have to make sure that Matt is going to learn from the experience, but we can't simply crucify Matt and the counterterrorism professionals, because then everybody leaves like me and nobody's there to defend us at all.
So I spent Tuesday in Denver visiting with the JTTF, the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force there, and then I went and visited the Fusion Center, the Colorado Fusion Center, and asked a lot of these questions about how they would work together. You're sort of looking at, in addition to Boston, how would that have happened? How would that have played out here? And it's actually obviously we can always do better, but there's a pretty good lash up there, and I think you can go back actually to a case that arose here in Colorado in a way, and that's Najib Bouzazi, a plot to carry out an attack on the subway in New York, and the FBI started here in the investigation of Zazi here in Aurora, Colorado. And it's probably not a good idea to sort of bring up the NSA program since you haven't asked about it, but we could talk about how Zazi is an example of that. But just in terms of local police departments working with fusion centers, working with the FBI, the Zazi case was a really good example in Colorado of a very effective investigation that then ended up moving by car across the country from Colorado to New York.
We'll get to the NSA stuff in a second, but let's talk about oversight of counterterrorism and the intelligence agencies. Mike, you recently summarized oversight of counterterrorism this way: the executive branch oversight, it operates in secret, congressional committees that operate mostly behind closed doors, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that is largely invisible to the public. So I have to say, as a journalist, when you sort of put it that pointedly, none of this inspires much confidence. At the same time, these institutions couldn't operate totally transparently. But the intelligence community, if the stories today in the paper are any indication, seem to be losing the confidence of some folks in Congress. Why should the public trust such a secretive oversight regime, and how can we improve it?
Well, two things I'd say. First, I hope events like this, when you see people like Matt Olsen, when you saw Raj Day, the general counsel from NSA, that inspires a little bit of confidence, because they're not a bunch of ogres. These are pretty thoughtful people who are tackling very hard jobs. Ash Carter, the list goes on and on, I think the officials we've had up here today. But second, I like to think of it as oversight serving two purposes. One is to make sure the government's actually doing things right, and two is to give the public confidence that the government is doing things right. Yeah. In my experience, oversight on the first piece works really well. If you do something wrong, there's going to be a congressman, there's going to be a senator, there's going to be a FISA court, there's going to be an inspector general, there's going to be a general counsel, there's going to be a civil liberties protection officer. It is possible that all of them can get snowed in, that all of them can be, you can snow them all and none of them will figure out something's going wrong. But in my experience, it's far from the case. So I think the oversight is working in terms of making sure people are following the rules. Your question of, is oversight working in terms of giving the public faith that the government is following the rules? I do think that that's where we have a failing. And that's not independent. It's not an independent problem of government. Look at polls of how much people trust Congress. Not especially high. So there's a lack of faith in people doing things right. I think you can increase transparency. You can't take it too far. If you go to full transparency like we do in other areas, we will have zero security.
But this is what I want to get at. What can you do?
Right, so
the executive branch, congressional, FISA, what can you change
The Bush
to make it more
administration and the
transparent?
Obama administration should have embraced the President's Civil Liberties Oversight Board, PCLOB, earlier than they did. They should have just held hearings now. The PCLOB should have been a more robust oversight board, which is selected in a bipartisan way, doing public hearings 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. They weren't. Now they will. That's good. Inspectors General can give more generic reports without disclosing sources and methods. Congressional oversight committees, the intelligence committees, can talk about the subjects that they're looking at without disclosing sources and methods. John McLaughlin noted, we do public intelligence oversight hearings. That's good. And I think even on the FISA Court, I would disagree respectfully with some of the prior panelists. The FISA Court can release some things. They can release how many cases they get, how many are denied, how many are sent back for review, the general types of issues they look at. You can have periodic review by other bipartisan commissions that have credibility looking at these things. So you can do it incrementally, but it is going to be difficult to swim against the general tide of distrust of government. And I would also be remiss if I didn't say I personally could not disagree with Anthony Romero more that Snowden did us a service. I think he did this country an incredible disservice. That we are now going to have slightly more transparency and better oversight is a good thing, but I refuse to give Mr. Snowden credit for that.
Give Snowden any credit?
No. But I mean, on the oversight piece, I think the 2008 changes to FISA and the 702 procedures that we've talked about much of today and there's so much in the news are a real example of, and it's hard to imagine an oversight regime that could exceed what has been done with FISA, where, and in particular with 702, where there was a public debate when the law was changed, where the FISA Court reviews the NSA's procedures, where Congress was directly involved in making those changes to FISA. And probably a lot of folks in the room don't realize that in 2008, the FISA Court of Review issued an opinion that upheld all of the way in which the NSA does this program under the prior statute, the Protect America Act, which was the predecessor to the FISA Amendment Act, but looked at this exact mechanism of targeting non-U.S. persons overseas and upheld it against a constitutional and statutory challenge. That probably hasn't really been reported very much, but that's a declassified opinion of the FISA Court of Review, Article 3, Court of Appeals judges, that have looked at this program and said that it's lawful. And so then you have ongoing oversight as that program carries out. So it's really hard for me to imagine an oversight regime that would exceed that. Now, the problem is, as Mike said—
I don't think you're using enough imagination.
Well,
I mean, as a lawyer, you have to look at the FISA Court, and there's no, what's the adversarial process?
Well, so there's no adversarial process when a prosecutor, Mike and I were both prosecutors, goes and seeks to get a search warrant. It is that you go to the judge, it's ex parte, and you present the facts. It's not adversarial, and I'm not aware of any other country in the world that has anything like a FISA court. So sure, you could make it adversarial. You would slow it down. You would risk, I think, unless you really did it very carefully, and it's hard to imagine how to do this, you would risk disclosure. But the problem, I think, is that, as Mike said, there is just a lack of confidence, and that's a problem that we have in trying to maintain these tools in our institutions of government. Ryan, you wrote in one of your pieces that I think Congress's stature was somewhere below head lice and above Ebola.
Yeah.
Right now. So
one of my favorite polls.
Yeah. So we're really that's hard for us because in the intelligence community we depend on our relationship, in particular with the intelligence committees, to provide the legitimacy that we need for our programs to carry them forward.
And Ryan, can I just
go
say
ahead.
quickly?
And then we'll do questions.
The question also is, where is the abuse? Now, I completely understand that some people think the collection itself is the abuse. But the fact is, the collection in that program has gone through our democratic process of government and the systems we've set up. So then the question is, the collection, if the collection is not the abuse, because that's been approved, where has the collection and analysis of the information been abused? Where are the results where people have been, arrested, persecuted, whatever it is? And so far, I have not seen that. So it's not that we don't have to have oversight to protect against this, but we can't just rush to the darkest corner of the room and assume that there's abuse going on when right now we seem to have a total absence of such circumstances.
You have some senators arguing that the authority has been exceeded or it's not what they intended.
That's right, and they can change that. And my argument would be they have repeatedly extended the FISA Act. It's been subject to the FISA Court review. Honestly, if there were senators, I don't really like the image of the senator who just sits up there and can't do anything. There are plenty of senators, plenty of congressmen who knew about this program. If they wanted to stop it, there's this little thing called the power of the purse. There's authorization acts. There are whole lots of ways that you can stop programs. And the fact is, the majority didn't win those cases.
Yeah. Let's open this great conversation up to questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So first hand go up there.
Mike, Representative Hank Naughton, I'm a member of the state legislature in Mass. I'm chair of the Homeland Security Committee. So on the Tsarnaevs, I probably about 50 questions, but I'll try to limit it to one and whatever you can put in there. I believe I heard you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that with the limited information that the FBI had previously, what was passed to them from the Russians, et cetera, that some mechanism should have been designed that if they weren't going to pursue it, they should have passed it on to someone else. And I'm taking the inference that someone else should have been Boston Police, Mass State Police. Could you expand on that? And if so, I ask if you understand the the complexities there of the cross-jurisdictional who's going to do what.
Sure.
I have an aide in my office who always says to me, everyone's job is no one's job, and it seems like that possibility could exist there.
I have a luxury here that I don't know any of the classified information about Tsarnaev, so I can speak about this in an unencumbered way, and not specific to Boston, as important as Boston is. This is how I think you could design a system. JTTF gets a tip. It could be from the Russians. It could be a domestic tip saying Bill Smith's a bad guy. FBI goes and investigates Bill Smith, interviews him, does all the things. They say, turns out Bill Smith's not a bad guy. Closes the case. That's what happened in Tsarnaev, as I understand it from public reports. You could have a system where that information, the FBI then turned to the state and local fusion center, wherever it is, and said, we had this case on Bill Smith. We didn't find anything. State and local authorities, you have different authorities as a local police officer. You can go knock on the doors. You can check with friends. If you want to do that, fine. We'll continue to do our search using data from other sources, but this is now yours if you want to do something with it. In reality, most state and local officials aren't going to do anything with that because they have other priorities. But that is a way of creating a safety net below kind of the federal investigative limits. Now, let me just say, this is not without real civil liberties implications. And I used this example with the Congress 2 weeks ago. This sounds great if you're dealing with someone named Tamerlan Tsarnaev. Now let's make it Bob Smith, who lives in Amarillo, Texas, and he's reported to be an anti-government guy who's stockpiling weapons. FBI goes and interviews him and says, no way, I'm a loyal American, I just like my guns. I'd never do anything bad. FBI closes the investigations, hands it off to the Amarillo police and says, you might want to keep your eye on old Bubba Smith out there because he's got a lot of guns. You think a few people in the Congress might have a problem with that? So we have to realize that we can increase the safety net we have, but it has implications for what state and local authorities do and how that potentially impinges on kind of civil liberties and how we want to live our life independent of official investigations.
Yeah, I completely agree with Mike on this. And the problem is, and it's the observation has been made, that we have this advantage of hindsight. And I think one lesson is that our collection capabilities, the way we are able to collect information, has increased the amount of information we have, so that almost inevitably, when something happens, when we have something like a Boston Marathon attack, we're going to be able to look back and find points of opportunity where we had an opportunity to engage or to do more. The lesson, the difficult lesson is, one, the FBI bases what it can do on the amount of information it has. So they predicate what they do based on how much information, and that's a tried and true way of conducting an investigation. How intrusive you're going to go in your investigation depends on how much information you have to show that the person is violating the law. And that's exactly what I think we want the FBI to do. The other aspect of, generally speaking, the opportunity within the JTTF structure, the whole idea there is so that information can be shared with state and local representatives who serve on the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and they, if they think it warrants, as a general matter, can share that information with their department.
Right there.
I'm Adam Teal. I'm the fire chief in Alexandria, Virginia, and I appreciate the conversation about state and local intelligence sharing and information sharing. Hi, Mike. I know it struck me earlier as we were having the conversation about connecting the dots that that's certainly the first thing, but not the only thing. There's still this matter of communicating the picture to the people who need to know at the right time and place. And certainly that includes my people. I think if you think of all of the iconic images of these events that we've had, firefighters are front and center in that, along with our colleagues in law enforcement. So what do you think we still need to do to be able to not just collect the dots, but communicate that information effectively to those people that essentially, are zero dark 30?
So I'll take the opportunity to answer in this way with respect very much an NCTC program and that we do with FBI and DHS. And Jane Harmon, if you're still here, was really one of the architects of this. And Mike had it when he was there. It was an organization within NCTC where we had a small number of state and local representatives from fire departments and police departments come and serve on detail for a year or two at NCTC, where they have access to all of the intelligence, all the clearances. They can look at all of the reporting and take that and turn it into, what would be useful for my department, my fire department, what would be useful for my police department. And then we write reports, what to look for, precursor chemicals, and when you happen to respond to into someone's house and you see something in a garage. So very helpful way for state and local firefighters and police officers to engage at the federal level and then be advocates on behalf of their home departments and the overall firefighter and police community. And this is a program we've continued now going forward in coordination with FBI and DHS, where we have people at NCTC who represent fire departments and police departments.
A huge part of this is getting it beyond law enforcement for every reason, both for the detection, the response, and the prevention in the first instance. Yeah. The FBI was doing engagement with the mosque that Tsarnaev belonged to and got in fights with people with. That's great. But you need lots of people other than ones carrying badges and guns doing that same engagement to try to reduce the attractiveness of al-Qaeda's message. You've got to engage the Muslim community as a real partner and not as an adversary. Going exactly to your point too, though, Alex, something that NCTC started right after the Mumbai attacks that I'm sure a lot of people remember back in 2008. Thank you. NCTC partnered with DHS, FBI, FEMA to go out and do training exercises across the country about how cities should respond to multi-casualty attacks and multi-shooter attacks. Well, about a year before Boston, NCTC with FBI, FEMA, DHS ran exactly that scenario with 100 plus, I think 150 plus representatives from across Boston, the private sector, hotels, business, fire, health, hospitals, going through those scenarios and discovering things like we're going to have a process for processing the video from cameras in stores. We're going to have to think about communications via cell phones if they go down during an attack. So again, you're not going to stop everything, but what you can do is help communities prepare for these horrible situations and really reduce the casualties that you might otherwise see and accelerate the investigation.
Anyone else out there? Yeah, right over here.
So while you're getting the microphone, in further response to your question, I think just important to think about the fact that We have about 12,000, 13,000, I think, FBI agents around the country. We have 2 million first responders, over 1 million firefighters, almost that many police officers. That is how we're going to stop the next, Boston type attack. That's how we're going to find that next homegrown extremist who's on that course from being radicalized to being mobilized to violence.
PJ Crowley from George Washington University. I'll direct the question to Matt. I know my friend Mike will chime in. 8 days after Benghazi, in a congressional hearing, you said Benghazi was an act of terror. We've had, obviously, a significant political and bureaucratic debate about talking points and what happened prior to that point. But what goes into the formal determination that something is an act of terror? Because depending on the political agenda, it could just be an act of thuggery, it could be an act of war, or it could be an act of terror. So, and for those of us who have been inside the system, 8 days for government's not necessarily bad.
Yeah, and I think the important point there, this is right after Benghazi. I was in a hearing that had been pre-scheduled, so it wasn't a Benghazi hearing, but I was asked that question. I mean, in the intelligence community, and I think I can speak for not just NCTC, but all of the analysts that were working on this, we proceeded on the assumption it was a terrorist attack from the beginning. I mean, you had a mortar attack, a pretty proficient mortar attack that killed Americans at a government facility in Benghazi. And so they clearly were targeting our presence there. It was violent. It resulted in death. I mean, there are a number of different legal definitions of terrorism, but really the practical common sense view that I think we all proceeded on from the outset was that this was a terrorist attack. Now, what that doesn't answer is a whole bunch of other questions that were more complicated. How coordinated was it? When had it been planned? Who was behind it? And those are other questions that we were still struggling with, and to a certain extent we're still struggling to this day, because that picture was really unclear then, as in some ways it is now. It wasn't particularly coordinated. It hadn't been planned for very long, if more than a few hours, we think. And it was carried out by a whole range of individuals, some extremists, but some sort of looters and thugs. But that doesn't take away from the bottom line that it was a terrorist attack. But those were still important questions that really, I think, the debate sort of obscured. It was a really more or less a political debate that obscured, our efforts in some ways just to really focus on who was responsible and what could we do about it.
I think the great thing about NCTC, first of all, I think it frankly is one of the great success stories of government reform post 9/11. I'm obviously biased, but I think that's the case. It still can do a lot of things better, but it's pretty darn good. And one of the great things about it is, regardless of how politically heated these discussions get, whether it's Benghazi or going back to Fort Hood, was that workplace violence or terrorism? I think John Brennan and Scott Redd and me and Matt have really tried to keep it a completely apolitical location. And it doesn't mean you don't have bureaucratic fights, but we called Fort Hood an act of terrorism a day after the shooting. We kind of call it as we see it. We're part of the intelligence community, and we want to inform the policy process in a way that we're giving the best efforts. And I'm sure that I honestly couldn't tell you the politics of almost anyone at NCTC. It simply wasn't an issue. Like, people came there to stop terrorists from killing Americans. Pretty straightforward, and not a lot of politics involved.
I think we're running out of time, so we probably have time for one more question right here.
Always gets the
Advantage of being in the front.
Cheers. Kim Dozier, AP. Just to follow up on one of the things that Matt said, and Mike, you can chime in. You said that you had seen Al-Qaeda and affiliate groups changing their ways. Did you mean specifically because of the Snowden leaks? Can you describe? And Mike, you said that you'd also seen evolutions. Can you give us some specific examples, since your hands aren't tied?
So the way I would say it, I would put it this way: what we're seeing is terrorist individuals, terrorists, and groups looking at this and seeking ways to circumvent our surveillance based on what they're learning from these recent leaks. Yes, from the Snowden leaks.
We have a strategic problem, and our strategic problem is we can't keep our national secrets secret. It's not to say everything that is classified should be secret, but those things that we should be protecting, we're not effectively protecting. That hurts our partners, whether they're corporate partners, foreign partners, and it helps our enemies. we've got to fix that. And I think one of the ways we fix that is somehow reinstituting some faith in oversight. So people say, if Matt has been working with the Congress, the House, the FISA Court, that's good enough. And if not, somebody in Congress is going to change the law, somebody's going to arrest Matt, or a court's going to tell them we're doing it wrong. And until we reinstitute that level of faith, I fear that Snowden will we'll have a continuing run of Snowdens.
I mean, I think, and to Mike's point too, I think we need to try to find ways to be more transparent, but there really are limits to how transparent we can be. And some of the arguments for transparency, in some ways, I see as a little bit of a Trojan horse by people who really just don't agree with what we're doing and knowing full well how it works. But I think, again, taking more a strategic view for a second, the challenge for us, everybody who goes to work at NCTC, like the intelligence community, there to protect the country. So to use Mike Hayden's metaphor of chalk marks on the cleats, we worry and we talk here in this room about the balance and finding the right balance. But ultimately, I want to know where that line is. I want to know, with a predictable way, how far we can go. And my job, Mike's job before, protect the country from terrorism. So I want my folks to go right as close to that line of legality and do everything that we can within the bounds of the law to stay in fair territory, but to go up to that line. And I think that's what we owe the American people. So as we move forward, we need to be more transparent, but I do hope that the oversight regime can gain the credibility that will allow us to continue to do our job.
All right, we have to leave it there. I want to thank you both for a great conversation. That was great. Thanks a lot.